Beware bad faith criticism, or bad criticism in general. Brandolini's law, aka the BS asymmetry principle, says disproving someone's absolute made-up BS takes way more effort than it took for them to make up that nonsense in the first place. And unfortunately for me, that's what I'll be spending my time doing for you today.
Nobody look! Nobody look! Nobody look! Nobody look!
We should all try to be more mindful when we're consuming any sort of media criticism anywhere online, whether it's on YouTube, Twitter, Reddit, wherever. Whether you're watching someone praise or pick apart a piece of media, really think about what you're hearing or reading. The truth is, many people in general are not super media literate. They don't know how to understand or analyze story or storytelling craft. And honestly, why would they? This isn't something that can really be taught. So for vast numbers of people to be on YouTube and social media in general, creating an entire category of content telling you how to perceive media as if they're experts is crazy, because most of those people are just random people. But this isn't inherently a problem, right? Anyone should be able to share their thoughts. And sure, there's a lot of good takes out there. Part of the fun is being able to talk through all these various ideas that people have about a piece of media. I actually go out of my way to avoid these types of videos, because when I don't, something like this will happen. I'll feel the need to make an entire video debunking the original, which in this case is a horrendously bad video, criticizing the writing of the intelligence of BBC Sherlock's Sherlock and Sage from The Boys. All timestamps below if you want to avoid spoilers, but still want to see what bad criticism looks like. However, the Sherlock portion won't really have spoilers, and if you haven't seen The Boys, don't even bother. I was unlucky to fall for this person's title and thumbnail, but maybe lucky in a way, because had I not seen their video, I also wouldn't have realized just how many people are willing to take what a random YouTuber says at face value. And you know what? Maybe this is a phase we all go through, especially those that are younger. I mean, y'all remember the days of CinemaSins, right? This person did a ton of misrepresenting and twisting, so if you're worried I might do the same to his video, feel free to go to his channel page, find the video, copy the link by clicking the 3 dots and clicking share, then put that in a YouTube to MP4 converter and download the video and watch it alongside my video so that you don't have to give him views, cause I'm pretty sure he made bank off of this. But if you're lazy and trust that I'm not a liar, I'll be recapping every single thing he said and explaining why it's wrong and what we can learn from this type of bad criticism. So the thesis of the video is that there's a problem with the way smart characters are written. He says you don't want the audience thinking the success was due to chance, and his perceived problem is that writers aren't writing intelligence the way it works in the real world. He says intelligence is written like magic, as a supernatural ability people were born with. But then his 2 examples are literally 2 of the only characters on the planet based on the premise that the character's intelligence comes from a quasi-supernatural ability. So right off the bat, you're not criticizing the writing of these characters. You're criticizing the literal premise of what you sat down to watch. He says this is done so characters can make leaps in deduction or pull off convoluted plans, and already it sounds like he wanted to make a video about these 2 characters to take advantage of the popularity of Sherlock and the recent release of The Boys Season 4 at the time it was published. He goes on to explain real intelligence comes from careful planning, adaptability, and the application of established knowledge. The irony is, his 2 examples literally have all 3 of these traits. So now going into the rest of the video, it's like, how does he prove otherwise? Because I already know the 2 characters they're talking about have exhibited planning, adaptability, and established knowledge in their respective shows. He claims that a truly intelligent character will establish the challenge or obstacle they need to overcome, construct a plan based on existing knowledge and abilities, enact that plan, and be able to improvise if challenges to that plan appear. Already his definition is so specific to the ability to enact a plan. So what I'm thinking is, after watching The Boys Season 4 and feeling dissatisfied, he wanted to single out the character of Sage, which unfortunately many people have been doing despite the fact that there are a myriad of problems in Season 4, and she is a symptom of the manufactured commentary-based plot-driven mechanics and characters of the entire show. I think he then decided to attach his criticism of Sage to a very popular similar character, Sherlock, so that people would actually watch the video. And it worked. Unfortunately, this is a recipe for bad faith criticism. He then says the cognitive function doesn't have to be visible to viewers, but the cause and effect between actions and outcomes should essentially showcase the thought process. This by itself is definitely right, but you'll see how he doesn't even correctly apply this. Also, right after he says this, he tells the viewer if any of this is unclear, don't worry, because in this video, he'll explore examples of how not to write smart characters and then the opposite. And hopefully after watching this video, you'll come away with a better idea of how to write such characters and how to make their victories and conclusions feel satisfied. So already he's presenting himself as an expert on the topic. He's not here to criticize or review, he's here to teach you, the ordinary person, that this is bad, this is good, and that this video is not simply his opinion, but specifically instruction on how to write. If that wasn't enough, he had the audacity to refer to his video as writing tips. Like, literally, who are you? What's crazy is that this actually would not have been a problem if he was actually right. Like, you're absolutely entitled to do that. You're entitled to share your thoughts on the internet. You're entitled to speak on things based on your own experiences and understandings. But to present your extremely incorrect analyses as prescriptive writing advice is wild. Like, at least get it right. So now let's get into his ridiculous breakdown of Sherlock. This guy says Sherlock is not an example of a well-written smart character, and he's effectively superhuman, and that if they had made the character psychic and a literal mind reader, it wouldn't change much about the plot. Well, you're gonna have to take that up with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle himself. But as a commenter on the video said, it's easy easy to criticize the modern day TV show. It's not easy to criticize one of the most prolific literary figures and authors to date. Now, I don't know if this person has ever seen any other rendition of Sherlock, which I have, including the pretty close adaptation featuring Jeremy Brett in the lead role, which I'll have linked for you below in a playlist in case anybody's interested in checking out those episodes. They're pretty cool. And I've also read several of the original stories. But anyone who knows anything about the originals can tell you that the scene this person criticizes is taken almost directly from the original, just updated for modern times. So your criticism really lies with the original author, who said that Holmes was inspired by the real-life surgeon Joseph Bell, who Doyle worked for. Like Holmes, Bell was noted for drawing broad conclusions from small observations. In a letter to Bell, Sir Arthur said this: "It is most certainly to you that I owe Sherlock Holmes, and though in the stories I have the advantage of being able to place the detective in all sorts of dramatic positions, I do not think that his analytical work is in the least an exaggeration of some effects which I have seen you produce in the outpatient ward." So already from this quote, you can see why Doyle might have chosen to write these stories from the perspective of Watson, who is an observer of these incredible deductions by Holmes. And so you're meant to feel this sort of element of wonder when it comes to Holmes's deductions. You're meant to be in Watson's shoes. So Arthur's quote then continues: "Round the center of deduction and interference and observation which I have heard you inculcate, I have tried to build up a man who pushed the thing as far as it would go, further occasionally, and I'm so glad that the result satisfied you, who are the critic with the most right to be severe." So you can see the author's goal was really to take something real and push it really far for his stories. In another letter he says, "Holmes is as inhuman as a Babbage's calculating machine," which was this big-ass calculator. So remember, this is the characterization of Holmes that exists in the original. But how does that translate to our discussion of the criticisms of the modern adaptation? So the video we're looking at, their analysis is of the scene where Sherlock and John meet for the first time. This scene is lifted partly from A Study in Scarlet, which is the original story, but modernized and compounded for A Study in Pink, which is the TV adaptation. The Afghanistan part is nearly identical, with both Sherlocks recognizing this on the spot. And in both scenes where Sherlock later explains all this to John, the reasoning is similar. For the sake of copyright, I'm not going to be playing the BBC version's audio, but I'll try to link a full clip below if I can find one. But I will read the book's version. "You appeared to be surprised when I told you on our first meeting that you had come from Afghanistan. You were told, no doubt." "Nothing of the sort. I knew you came from Afghanistan. From long habit, the train of thoughts ran so swiftly through my mind that I arrived at the conclusion without being conscious of intermediate steps. There were such steps, however. The train of reasoning ran, here is a gentleman of a medical type, but with the air of a military man. Clearly an army doctor then. He's just come from the tropics, for his face is dark, and that is not the natural tint of his skin, for his wrists are fair. He has undergone hardship and sickness, as his haggard face says clearly. His left arm has been injured. He holds it in a stiff and unnatural manner. Where in the tropics could an English army doctor have seen much hardship and got his arm wounded? Clearly in Afghanistan. I then remarked that you came from Afghanistan, and you were astonished." If you've seen the BBC version, you can already pick up on how similar it is. The differences here are: 1, the modern age actually had 2 wars, so Sherlock had to ask if it was Afghanistan or Iraq. And then 2, in the original story, Mike Stamford then tells Sherlock, "Hey, John's looking for an apartment," while in the show, Sherlock deduces it. How does he deduce it? We learn his reasoning later, and it makes perfect sense. If Sherlock says to Mike in the morning, "Hey, I'm looking for a flatmate," and then later that same day, Mike shows up with a retired army doctor with an injury specifically with the purpose of introducing him to Sherlock, then gee, I wonder if this guy's looking for a flat share. If it was some random guy, maybe he's just Mike's friend, but he came specifically to find Sherlock on this exact day, and plus, John checks all the boxes. That's key, because you can't connect the dots with 2 pieces of information. But when you have all the information that Sherlock has, like he always says, when you rule out the impossible, the result, however improbable, must be the truth.
Told Mike this morning that I must be a difficult man to find a flatmate for. Now here he is, just after lunch with an old friend, clearly just home from military service in Afghanistan.
So now they've added in the deduction about John's phone. John lets Sherlock borrow his phone, which allows Sherlock to see the engraving on the back. He tells John later he deduced that the phone was his brother's because the phone was expensive, had an engraving from a loved one, the engraving had 3 X's, and basically this is like a mental list of crossing out possibilities until he has enough evidence to where it can only point to John getting his phone from a sibling. And even then, the actual deduction of Harry being John's brother is wrong, because Harry is his sister. So already, we're seeing that despite being thorough, he's in such a rush to show off that he can still make mistakes. And plus, there's literally nothing that could tell him Harry's gender, apart from Harry being a super common guy's name in Britain. He can't fathom that Harry would be short for Harriet, which John tells him later. And like the book Sherlock says, all of this takes a second in his mind. Think of it like Sherlock doing a mental Venn diagram for John. That's how his reasoning works. It's combining patterns, crossing out possibilities, testing, gathering information, etc. It's not magic. The only bit of magic in this comes not from the character writing, but from the writers giving them a phone that has a very specific inscription on it. Like, I've personally never seen that, but when everything else works, this sort of super tiny thing can be overlooked because ultimately it serves the purpose of proving Sherlock's deductive skills while amplifying the impressiveness a bit. The one deduction that might seem a bit iffy is that Harry must be a drunk because of the scuff marks around the charger. As someone who used to have a similar phone that I plugged in the dark, I've seen scuff marks form as well. He could have said this in the show, and he sort of does by saying John would take extra special care of his one expensive item, and therefore the scratches had to come from the previous owner. And he also explains that in his experience, he's never seen a sober person's phone with them and never seen a drunks without them. And let's not forget that in this deduction alone, Sherlock has displayed extreme arrogance, which is crucial to his character. So even if he was taking a shot in the dark, no pun intended, it would only be because he thinks he has enough life and observational experience to be above that. And by the way, double no pun intended, because Sherlock literally says it was a shot in the dark, and he just happened to be right. So already they're establishing that yes, a couple of these are guesses. They're not trying to trick the audience to think he's a genius for knowing about the drinking. They're showing that with his deductive reasoning, the shot he made had a very high chance of landing, and in this case it did, which boosts him up even higher to maximize the later impact of John saying Harry is his sister. Sherlock says in the scene that he's guessing about the drunk because, let's be honest, we do have an alternative, and that alternative is Junkie, which Sherlock would definitely know all about. Furthermore, this is a very tiny nod to something that appears in the second of the original books, the sign of 4. In the book, Watson has a watch with the engraving HW, which Holmes deduces was from his brother, who inherited the watch from their father, with the scratches and practically the same dialogue as the show. Look at the thousands of scratches all around the hole. Marks where the key is slipped. What sober man's key could have scored these grooves, but you will never see a drunkard's watch without them. But even if the show hadn't been super explicit about any of this, even if Sherlock wasn't written to have the fatal flaw of arrogance, even if Sherlock hadn't said this could be one or the other, even if he didn't cross out the other alternatives, even if he couldn't distinguish the very specific scruff marks, it would ultimately still have been a tiny detail that exists to supplement these other deductions, and all of this is ultimately to make Sherlock's extensive and very, very invasive deductions come off to John not as creepy, but as impressive.
That was amazing.
Not what people normally say.
What do people normally say?
Piss off.
And since this is a show specifically about their relationship as friends, this characterization and development in the relationship is incredibly critical. It has to be really personal stuff that Sherlock deduces, and John has to not be offended by it like everyone else. That's the catalyst of their whole partnership. Not to mention, they're heading to meet people who see Sherlock as creepy. And plus, Sherlock will later use the Pink Lady's phone to do some larger scale deducing. So it's a double setup that proves his skill with the two things, person and phone, that he'll need to analyze later under different circumstances. Now, with all this in mind, let's see what our self-proclaimed writing instructor says. He specifically lists Sherlock's deductions in the following ways: Army doctor, wounded in action and therefore deployed in Iraq or Afghanistan, his phone was a gift from his sibling who Watson isn't close to, and that the sibling is an alcoholic due to the scratch marks on the phone. Notice this guy said sibling, while Sherlock specifically says brother, because this is something that the show includes as a specific scene point later on, to show Sherlock not only getting something wrong, but to then have Sherlock say, there's always something, indicating that this always happens. But this guy just ignores that completely. He says because the point of the scene is to show how clever Sherlock is, Sherlock's right about 99% of his conclusions. And already, that's wrong. As we just discussed, the point of the scene is not only to show the cleverness, but specifically to set up John's impressed reaction as a contrast to Sally Donovan and others later on. This show's entire main theme is friendship. Every single episode is about developing that relationship. Every single interaction, and even scenes where they're not directly interacting with each other, contributes to their overall relationship and growth as a result of being friends with each other. And these two scenes with the deduction and explanation are instrumental in setting that up. And the second one, by the way, kicks off with John making a deduction about Sherlock. He says he'd say Sherlock was a private detective, but the police don't go to private detectives. How does he know this? John's life experiences have told him that private detectives have these abilities, but Sherlock can't be one because they're on their way to a crime scene that the police called them to. And again, from life knowledge, he knows that the police don't consult private detectives. So when the only possibility isn't a possibility at all, there must be something else, which he doesn't know because Sherlock invented the job. So again, from very early on, we're already seeing this back and forth between Sherlock and John, the way they complement each other. The video then says that the problem with the scene is that Sherlock isn't actually deducing anything and instead highlights the show's misrepresentation of intelligence. Again, it seems like this guy is operating under the presumption that Sherlock is meant to represent intelligence. He's not a cardboard cutout. Sherlock in this show isn't just this brainiac. He's a guy who works in a specialized field that requires these skills. Yes, he's a very intelligent person, but so is John, so is Mycroft, so is Lestrade, so is Molly. He's surrounded by people who are intelligent in different ways from him, and this serves to highlight Sherlock's own shortcomings, which is important to his character development in this show. Then this guy continues by saying what Sherlock is actually doing is making a mixture of guesses and assumptions based on observations and presenting them as irrefutable facts, which ironically is the video's misrepresentation of the show.
Do you really not know that the Earth goes around the sun? Any ideas?
Maybe 2 ideas.
No, don't mention the unsolved ones.
You got it wrong.
A bit.
But hey, as long as you repeatedly slap the same stock video of a neuron pulsing brain on the screen, it looks like you're talking real science. The irrefutable facts thing isn't bad writing because it's literally Sherlock's character to be that arrogant.
Look at you lot, you're all so vacant. Is it nice not being me? It must be so relaxing.
It's not bad writing for a character to be skilled at something and then be arrogant because of it. And even then, Sherlock asks John in a later scene if he got everything right, and he's kind of patting himself on the back for getting everything right, saying he wasn't expecting everything to be right. And just when he's built himself up to the max, John says Harry is short short for Harriet, and Sherlock comes crashing down. This moment tells us everything about who Sherlock really is, showing us that even those we perceive as the most intelligent can ultimately still be fallible. Sherlock's arc in this show is about unlocking his inner humanity because of John.
I don't have friends, I've just got one.
And having John deliver this blow in such a way is the epitome of good writing. This video turns the complex idea of what intelligence is into something very black and white, and then tries to force his examples into boxes that fit with what he wants to say. But we're not quite done with Sherlock just yet, because now the speaker says, since Sherlock speaks with such authority and the show usually shows him to be right, the audience forgets about the dozens of alternative explanations for those observations. Again, the irony here is astounding, because this guy is speaking with such authority that most of his audience just accepts what he says at face value. But at this point, it's like, okay, maybe he's gonna back up his opinion with some analysis and fact, like I did previously.
I'm not gonna stand here, present some egghead scientific argument based on fact.
He says Sherlock's true impressive ability here is that he's hyper-observant, able to pick up details about a person, but that his actual deductive ability is shown to be so superhumanly accurate that it's effectively a superpower. Now this is getting interesting, because isn't the ability to be hyper-observant still a subset of intelligence? If you knew someone who took the time to be attentive or had wired their brain to pay attention to the little things, wouldn't you consider that person to have intelligence in this particular avenue? That would be someone who makes an effort to know things. But now we're getting to my favorite part, which is this guy saying, hey, let's do an exercise to illustrate this. He says he's going to make his own conclusions based on the observations that Sherlock made. Unfortunately for his audience, no one's there to point out that this is a false equivalency.
That's a false equivalency.
That's when you try to compare two things that are not equivalent for the sake of an argument. You should be able to hold the other variables equal to each other in order to see if the outcomes are equal when you change something. That's why in the scientific method that they teach you since elementary school, when you're trying to figure out how much sunlight is best for your plant, you're not also going to be changing how much water you give it, because when plant A is better than plant B, how do you know it was the sunlight or the amount of water that made it grow taller? But if both plants get equal amounts of water and everything else is the same, and plant A gets 5 hours of sunlight for 5 days, while plant B gets 2 hours of sunlight for 5 days, and plant A grows taller, then you should know that the result is based on the sunlight. This guy can't compare his results to Sherlock because the variables are not consistent. For one, you're a random person. Sherlock is a professional consulting detective with years of experience in the field and cases consulted, and a graduate chemistry degree, access to a lab and at-home equipment that lets him continue to run experiments, and a side hustle as a blogger who actively seeks out patterns in the world and learns anything that might be useful to his field. Plus a brother who's better at this than him that he sometimes riffs with, a mother who was a mathematician, and there's probably more I'm forgetting. Comparing your deductive reasoning to Sherlock as a way of proving that he's badly written is like saying I didn't put any sunlight, water, or nutrients in my plant, and Sherlock did all of the above, but his plant was tall and mine died, which means Sherlock must have used magic to make his plant grow, because there's no possible way for it to grow otherwise. An actual equivalency there, in case you're interested. So this guy looks at Watson and makes the following deductions. Watson works for a charity group in active conflict zones like Doctors Without Borders, which explains his stern demeanor. Watson enjoys outdoor activities like gardening, where he wears gloves and tries to keep himself physically fit, i.e. cycling, and this explains the tan on his face but not below the wrists. Third, Watson suffered his leg injury while working for the charity or from some kind of traumatic event he witnessed while working for the charity. Fourth, phone was a gift from his father, who he assumes is some kind of businessman who travels a lot due to the sophistication of the phone, and also suffers from Parkinson's, which explains the scratch marks, and gifted the phone to Watson to attempt to bring the two of them closer together. He then says, I'm no Sherlock Holmes, but it seems to me that these are just as likely as Sherlock's conclusions. It's very tongue-in-cheek so he can connect with his audience. He first gives you these 4 deductions, and then he tries to be cheeky while affirming these are just as likely as Sherlock, thereby closing in on the false equivalency. And at a glance, if you're watching this, you might be like, oh yeah, he's right, these totally make sense. Not because you thought through this yourself, but because he just told you that this makes sense. So then let's take the time to go through why Sherlock would rule out these deductions. First of all, military man versus stern demeanor, big difference. A lot of people could probably tell from the way someone carries themselves that they've been in the military. But remember, the Venn diagram, Sherlock is making his deductions based off all the available information. This video guy is doing direct one-to-one correlations because that's how Sherlock presents the explanations to John after the fact. But explaining how you did something isn't the same as actually doing it. Sherlock's taking an instinctive and intuitive process with years of experience required and making that easy for John to understand. Even the book Sherlock Holmes quote I read earlier explained that he did his deductions instantaneously. Now, I'm no Sherlock, but it seems to me that John Watson can shoot a gun. See, I can do it too. I mean, John Watson is designed from costume to acting to overall look to appear as the typical military man, so that the casual viewer can see that that, yep, he's a military man. You have to remember that the writing is working in tandem with the visual direction, and if the visual direction says make John look like a military guy, then that's because in the story world, he's a guy who looks like a military guy. And Sherlock, being a member of that story world, unlike this creator or even me, has now shown with his dialogue that he knows John is a military man because he fits the profile of what military men look like in Sherlock's experience in the established story world. He's not getting military man from stern demeanor. He's getting it from the combination of the haircut, how John carries himself, the shoulder injury, the not leg injury, the tan, the fact that Mike's here introducing him to someone who needs a flat, and I could go on, but the point is, Sherlock is operating from the culmination of all the knowledge he has, and this writing works in tandem with the way John is physically depicted on the screen, which helps us, the viewers, understand Sherlock's deduction, and why the deduction of Doctors Without Borders doesn't work because those people are civilians with no military training, and anyone who knows anything about military training is that it's extremely strict, regimented, and even the average non-detective person can probably tell when someone's just recently served in active duty. For reference, see Hell's Kitchen Season 6, but they can speak for themselves, they know who they are.
I ain't no bitch.
An army doctor is specifically a doctor and a soldier, and so with the way John physically looks and presents himself and all the other information about him, we can effectively rule out Doctors Without Borders, and furthermore, you making purposely twisted deductions based on what the costume designer and actor is doing is not equivalent to Sherlock making deductions about John. If you're gonna cross into the story world, be aware of the differences.
This is real life.
The next deduction, which explains the tan, is that Watson enjoys outdoor activities. But if you just deduce that he works in active conflict zones like in Afghanistan, then shouldn't that explain the tan? Again, he's looking at individual pieces of evidence and tying them to random conclusions to make his point. He's missing the forest for the trees. Sherlock says John must have been abroad, not sunbathing. This is a deduction that goes along with the previous deduction. It's not separate, and so the question of gardening gloves has no relevance because we've already established that John's recently returned from abroad. Why recently returned? Because John shows up looking around Bart's, taking in how it's changed. If he'd been there a while, Mike could have brought him here earlier, but he brought John now, and not just as a friend. He brought him specifically to meet Sherlock. Why? Well, we covered this already. That morning, Sherlock said he must be a difficult man to find a flatmate for. So why is Mike Stamford bringing his old med school friend specifically to Sherlock at this specific location on this specific day? Just showing him around? Again, Venn diagrams. You have to look at all of the pieces of the puzzle together. So using this guy's own deductions, if he thinks Watson does Doctors Without Borders, then that automatically accounts for the tan, and he doesn't need to come up with the gardening gloves, whereas Sherlock references the tan as just a piece of the overall puzzle that is John Watson. Next, we move on to Sherlock's deduction about the limp. As a reminder, this guy said the limp comes from a leg injury from working with the charity or witnessing a traumatic event. Sherlock says John's limp is bad when he walks, but he doesn't ask for a chair when he stands, and it doesn't seem to bother him, suggesting that it's at least partly psychosomatic. Notice how Sherlock even includes this qualifier, at least partly. He's saying based on the fact that you were limping before but then stopped and didn't seem to be in pain, the severity of your leg injury is at least partly in your head. That's not genius level deduction. That's like saying, oh, you crawled instead of walked up the stairs, but then you stood up perfectly okay without taking a breather or a moment, which means your crawling is at least partly due to you making it more dramatic in your head. Is this a sound equivalency? I don't know, but I swear I'm not doing this on purpose. A better one is maybe you threw a tantrum about your birthday present, but then 2 minutes later you were playing with the present, so we can guess that the tantrum was at least partly for the sake of being dramatic. Let me stop doing these. The video guy also said the trauma thing, and it's technically the same conclusion. The only thing that's different is the part of the deduction that came from deduction number 1, the war thing. Both the guy and Sherlock are saying that the injury came from trauma and happened in a war zone, and we can rule out the witnessing of a traumatic event because John is using a cane, but on the wrong side. You're supposed to use a cane to support the injury on the opposite side. If a doctor is using a cane on the right side for an injury also on the right side, then it's partly because of a real injury that happened on the left side. Sherlock doesn't spell out anything related to the cane or the limp because of the cane experiment he does later in the episode, and also because we find out more about John's injury from Mycroft, who knows about John's intermittent tremors in his left hand from his therapist's notes. But why didn't Sherlock say this? Because first of all, he's not having to explain his deductions to someone challenging him, he's explaining it to someone who's just curious. 2, the reveal about the tremors is much better if it's Mycroft who does it, and in the context of that scene. 3, there's only so many explanations you can take before it goes from wow, that's cool, to dude, just get on with it. I mean, did y'all actually sit through my reasoning or skip ahead? It's not the most interesting thing in the world, let's be real. The writer streamlined the dialogue for both John and the audience, while also hitting the most essential points to convey Sherlock's abilities beyond a reasonable doubt, not getting lost in the explanations because, like I said before, the point of the scene is to show that Sherlock's weirdness doesn't faze John. So we've covered the army doctor and injury stuff. Let's move on to this guy's final deduction, which is about the phone. Why is the phone not from John's father, who got a sophisticated phone for business purposes? This deduction is probably to counter Sherlock saying this is a young man's gadget. Remember that this is 2010 and John's about early 30s, so his father would probably be 50s or 60s. So if not retired, then is it possible he's a businessman who needs an expensive email-enabled phone with an MP3 player? Well, remember that later Sherlock deduces about the Pink Lady's phone phone that it must be a smartphone for her to do her business on since there was no laptop in sight. John's phone isn't a smartphone though, so if his dad is a businessman, shouldn't he have a smartphone instead of getting this young man's gadget, especially if this businessman also has Parkinson's, which is another reason to get the smartphone and not this phone. Then we have Clara, ex-stepmother maybe rather than ex-sister-in-law, and clearly she's gifted him the wrong phone for his lifestyle, so she cares him enough to give this expensive gift even though he's a businessman who can afford to buy his own phone, and according to you, he would have to for work. Then why is he getting it as a gift? Is she paying for the work phone for him? The pieces of this puzzle just aren't lining up, so we ruled out the possibility of it being for work because it's not a work phone, and Sherlock would know that because he later identifies what a work phone does look like, and therefore the phone must be for personal use, especially if it has an engraving on it. Would John's father's ex-wife give a man who's no younger than late 50s, early 60s a new model phone with email and MP3 for personal use in the year 2010 when not only Sherlock but also I personally did not see people of that age carrying around anything more than a flip phone, if any phones at all? Remember that the context of your deduction is different from Sherlock's. You're 14 years removed, so even though now everyone seems to have the same level of smartphone regardless of age, back then smartphones were pretty new, and even those types of slidey phones weren't super common above a certain demographic since the older crowd went from decades of landlines to cordless to flip phones in about 10 years. And if Sherlock is an extreme observer who walks around London seeing all kinds of people, then his knowledge includes which types of phones belong with which demographics. And in that era, he obviously saw this specific phone with young men and not with older men in the crowded and diverse metropolitan that is London. So it's safe to say he's got a pretty good survey of the ecosystem. And once again, to bring back the Venn diagram, Sherlock may be explaining this to John piece by piece and in a simplified way, but the way his brain works is by putting all the information he knows together in a puzzle, and that puzzle came up with man who dumped a phone gifted to him by his ex-wife onto his closest relative who refuses to go stay with him after the war. Is it the young brother who recently left his ex after getting a brand new model phone that's perfect for him? Or is it a father who left either a longtime mother or a recent stepmother after getting a brand new model phone that no one else his age uses? And again, I've spent like a whole year on this deduction, so you can see why they didn't explain it beyond young man's gadget in the show. And knowing it's a young man rules out Parkinson's, which is very rare for young people, and we can rule it out completely because again, the extremely long discussion I had previously about the specificity of the scruff marks and Sherlock saying it was a shot in the dark that the man was a drunk. Not to mention if John the doctor was reluctant to see a brother that has Parkinson's and Clara the ex-wife gifted him a phone not suitable for Parkinson's, then that doesn't really look good for either of them. And by the way, we're still not done with the Sherlock portion of the video I'm criticizing. So imagine if all of this was in the show. Pages of dialogue justifying to a random person who doesn't exist within the story world, doesn't have Sherlock's particular set of skills, just because they can't follow the show's logic because of their own shortcomings.
What is it like in your funny little brains?
So anyway, this guy says the only difference between his deductions and Sherlock's is that Sherlock almost always gets the correct answer out of dozens of plausible scenarios. But we've proved that these other scenarios don't exist because we're looking at the answers like a puzzle or a Venn diagram and not a tree with many branches. He then says if Sherlock was written realistically as an intelligent character, he would have to do some investigating and ask some follow-up questions. He literally does. He constantly mentions this is likely. He even tells us later there was a shot in the dark. And plus remember that John doesn't actually correct him about brother versus sister. And why would he? The first time they meet, John's incredibly taken aback and impressed. And the later scene where Sherlock is explaining this, John just says, and Sherlock carries on, and later it turns out that this was the thing he was wrong about. This guy even says investigating is what distinguishes a character with true intelligence from a character with magical intelligence. Like, okay, we're just not going to acknowledge that John literally met Sherlock while Sherlock was doing investigative research and experimentation for a case. Not only is this video's analysis incorrect, but this analysis of Sherlock's entire character writing is based on this one scene where he's deducing stuff about John. This video guy says intelligent people make initial observations, form hypotheses based on the observations, then they seek out additional information to test that, and then use reasoning to arrive at the most probable conclusion. Bruh, is that not literally what Sherlock did? That's the whole point of Sherlock walking through his explanation. Like, why are you literally lying? Then he goes on to say here's a quote from Terry Pratchett that basically says there's multiple possible explanations and puts the quote up on the screen. But this quote is from a Discworld novel in which the character is trying to figure out a mystery, and Discworld is a fantasy satire with many references to pop culture, specifically to Sherlock Holmes, directly quoting him in one book, and then in this book with this quote, it's a riff on the original Sherlock Holmes trope created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who created the character and thus what much later became a trope. And Discworld is a modern day series, and in this particular book, the author sort of pokes fun at the practicality of the Holmes trope. So quoting this character's experience with this type of detective work in a fantasy satire fiction book to prove that BBC Sherlock specifically is badly written is like the weirdest possible way to end your argument. Like, did you even read the book? Or did you just go online looking for famous authors who hated on Sherlock? Which, by the way, Terry Pratchett didn't, or he wouldn't have made a direct homage to Holmes in another book. So how is it that people were so susceptible to this extremely bad faith analysis?
You actually don't believe in evolution anymore?
Well, this is what he did. He started with a very narrow definition of intelligence, framed himself as a teacher, then claimed Sherlock's intelligence is poorly written. And to back this up, he referred to 2 scenes in the entire show, both of which are from the pilot. He listed the deductions very broadly, said it's magic, made his own deductions, and said these explain X, Y, and Z, which unless you've seen the show recently or you're directly referencing that scene, you wouldn't know how that translates to the Sherlock deductions and explanations. For example, the tan isn't referenced beyond, here's my deduction which explains the tan. And these are misrepresented as well, like stern demeanor as opposed to military man. So clearly, he's intentionally leaving out how the actual scene unfolds so that you have to take his word at face value, even though he's created a complete false equivalency between himself and Sherlock. He then simply tells you that both his and Sherlock's deductions hold equal weight, and therefore Sherlock is badly written. And for further proof, here's this out of context quote from a book he didn't read. When it's laid out like this, of course people just took it at face value and agreed with him.
Created a reasonable doubt. He makes you sound like a stupid science bitch.
He doesn't take into account literally any other deductions or scenes from the entire rest of the show. Doesn't take into account context, characters, scene purpose, anything at all. He simply extracts a scene and also its follow-up scene and forces it to fit his narrative by leaving out information. And this made a huge impact because the vast majority of the comments are about Sherlock, not any of the other characters discussed. I called him out on his analysis and he said he agreed but also doubled down at the same time. You can check out my article linked below, which will show these comments as well. Now let's move on to Sage. So just like I predicted, he states that the reason he came up with this topic was because he recently watched season 4 of The Boys prior to that video coming out. He says Sage is introduced as the smartest person in the world and that going off her own claims, she can cure climate change and cancer if she wanted to. She's brought on by Homelander, who halfway through the season no longer wants her help, and then she comes back at the end saying everything that happened this season was the plan, with some curveballs. This is mostly accurate to what happened in the show, except Homelander dismisses Sage in episode 7, which is the penultimate episode of the season. And Sage doesn't claim that everything that happened this season was her plan. She specifically claims that Victoria Newman dying was the plan. He says the big problem is we don't see Sage's plan taking action, which results in an outcome and then her further actions based off that outcome. And he says that because of this, when she makes her claim in the final episode, you're left thinking, really? Now here's the interesting part. In my video and article where I criticized the writing in The Boys season 4, I did mention that ending. I said it was weird that Sage came back saying it was still the plan all along. But that's not because of her character. It's because of the scene itself. And I'll come back to this once we get some further context. This guy says it's impossible for her to control the actions of various people across the season, and here are the things she had no control over. 1. No plan to get rid of Newman. 2. She lied to Homelander about A-Train being the leak and didn't have a plan for whether he would laser her, which he's done to others because he's unstable. And 3. She was lucky to get Singer on the Shifter's camera saying you should have killed Newman and then get that footage. And basically she had no way to guarantee she would get this. So let's break this down. The first statement is operating under the idea that Sage is telling Homelander the truth, or the full truth at least. She says Newman would have been a bad patsy because she had too many ideas, which is true, and from Homelander's perspective this makes sense because in episode 6's scenes involving the 3 of them, Newman kinda showed up both of them. But also in that episode, Sage and Newman have a conversation in which Sage reveals her anger toward the people in the world who have all this control. She tells us this story about how she wasn't taken seriously when she wanted to cure her grandma, and now it's like, what's the point of even trying? She kind of bonds with Victoria by saying you and I aren't like them, we've had to deal with stuff, and I just want to make them pay. I'm heavily paraphrasing, but from the subtext and the acting, Sage was definitely telling the truth, which made me believe something I speculated since we first saw her, that she's not fully on Team Homelander, and she has her own hidden agenda. Now if that's true, obviously the show's not going to come out and say, by the way, Sage is lying to Homelander in this scene, and she's doing that because she has the secret agenda that we were going to reveal to you next season, but had to do it now because PhD wannabes can't wait that long. So if she is lying and Newman's death wasn't the plan, then that means she must have had a contingency in place. For us to not see that is not bad character writing, it's a problem with the scene itself. All we would have needed would be one shot of Sage hearing the news about Newman, looking at the secret shifter camera thing in her hand, then cutting to Homelander and the balloons. The writer didn't omit this to make a character look smart, they omitted this to shock the audience. If you're gonna be out here giving prescriptive writing advice, at least be able to discern between different types of writing problems, because this is something they use the entire season, which I talked about in my season 4 video, about how with every character it's like, surprise, this happened, and surprise, they did this, and surprise, there's this problem. And it felt like rather than trying to tell a story, the writers just wanted to be like, surprise, every 5 seconds. Okay, but what if she's telling the truth and Victoria dying and Singer being arrested and the speaker becoming president was the plan? Well, again, that's not bad character writing, that's bad plotting. It signifies that the writers needed Sage gone for a hot sec because they couldn't justify her sticking around after the leak stuff, but they also couldn't justify her coming back unless it was the plan. And why did they need her gone? Because remember, surprise, that's been the main driving force of that season, just surprising the audience, make them think everything's falling apart for Homelander, especially with Sage's final warning to him before she left, and then surprise, it's all according to plan. Flipping out the rug from under the audience and saying, don't worry, the boys don't win this season, Homelander's on top, and you'll get your little dystopian fantasy next season. Regardless though, it's not a stretch to think she had a way to get that footage footage because the shifter thing was her plan. We literally saw her talking to the shifter when the boys were stalking her to figure out what the plan was. Why else have a camera in the bunker where the president is supposed to get assassinated by somebody who looks like Annie if you have no access to that footage to later frame her? Maybe it's a cloud-based thing, I don't know, but again, like I said, we just would have needed that single 5-second scene showing Sage in the aftermath of Victoria's death, which takes care of this guy's third claim. Now let's move on to the claim that it's bad writing for Sage to not think Homelander would laser her after he found out A-Train was the leak. Let's recall episode 1, where Sage says, "You're welcome to laser me, but I don't think you're gonna do that." Why is this important? Because it's now time to dismantle yet another assumption about Sage. Her superpower is not magical intelligence. Her superpower is the ability for the brain to regenerate. We learned this in episode 4 when she explains to the Deep. We even kind of learned this when we first meet her and she's studying, reading a book while listening to a different book at the same time. So her intelligence comes from her ability to expand her knowledge infinitely. Learn how to do this, know how to execute that, figure things out, etc. Her power is derived from her brain's regenerative abilities. So even though that doesn't mean she can predict things, it does mean she's able to visualize and access many outcomes and paths and possibilities because she has studied for this. I can't emphasize this enough because intelligence is not magical if you studied for it. And man, I hate to defend this show and particularly this season, but there's just so much bad faith criticism going around that I kinda have no choice. It's entirely believable that Sage knows she won't be lasered because of her personal experience with Homelander and the unique relationship that they have. Homelander may laser people that betray him, but from the moment they've met, Sage has been different. And for all its many faults, this show has been able to convey that fact. And above all, she's much too useful to be lasered, and she knows that Homelander knows that she kept the truth from him because Homelander isn't stable, which she said in the first episode that she hopes he won't feel insecure because of her. And she says again in episode 8 that she had to keep a few things from Homelander because he's Homelander. All of this is consistent with her character. Maybe your issues with the plot itself, which needs Sage alive but also temporarily gone. Both the show and the season aren't bad because of the suspension of disbelief. They're bad because we don't care about any of the characters or what happens, and the plot is extremely manufactured. But at the very least, it's not difficult to understand what's actually going on. So then this guy comes in and says, here's my general guideline, like he's some screenwriting professor, and the guideline is, if your writing involves a character coming in after a whole series of events that they had nothing to do with and then claim it was all according to their plan, please stop immediately and reevaluate your plot. Okay, so you agree it's the plot that's the problem, right? Not the character. He makes up this random ass name for it called the retroactive genius trope, where a character claims credit for a complex series of events that are unrelated to them, and he says this is a lazy way of establishing intelligence. I can't even think of any instances of this so-called trope. That's not a character trope as much as a solve the mystery with a massive info dump trope, like when the villain is basically monologuing about how everything that has happened has been according to their plan. And that's not bad character writing, that's the writer not being able to thread the how-done-it part through the story without giving away the who-done-it, so they remove the how-done-it and have the who tell us at the end. And furthermore, it's not a lazy way of establishing intelligence, it's a lazy way of telling us what happened. This guy specifically says characters claiming credit for events unrelated to them, but there's no example of this. The events are always related. Even Sage is related to the presidential succession. She may not have planned for what happened with Victoria, but she's still related to the overall plan to seat a patsy for Homelander. And in fact, it's her plan. Like, I am baffled by this train of thought. Ironically, the guy says that it leans into the cardinal sin of storytelling, which is telling rather than showing. But you weren't able to recognize what the purpose of the telling was. We're not being told this was the plan all along to show Sage is intelligent. We're being told because the writers wanted to surprise us and show us that Homelander was back on top after all. So don't lecture people about show don't tell when you can't even recognize the root problem behind the telling. He then goes on to say this creates plot holes or inconsistencies if you really think about it. Well, no, this specific made-up trope you're talking about, for which no example exists, doesn't inherently create any plot holes. In Sage's case, it's not a plot hole, it's an omission of information from the audience. And plus, we've already established Sage's case isn't the specific made-up trope with no examples. I mean, maybe there are some examples out there, but I've yet to see any, because why would the events ever be unrelated to the person claiming credit for them unless it's like some god-type figure that we haven't been introduced to before in the show? I feel like when you make up these very specific character trope generalizations, you gotta have some examples handy. He mentions a character from the anime Bleach, but says he won't discuss it, and maybe that's because of spoilers or something, I don't know. But I haven't seen the anime, so I don't know what he's talking about. And if your argument is based on just one example that people may not have seen that you also won't explain, even in vaguer terms, then that's not really helpful. He says as a thought exercise, a better way to write Sage would have been the following. She should have been shown making predictions and preparations early in the season, demonstrate her adaptability when plans go awry. She should have been revealing steps of her plan as the season progressed, and then finally and optionally seeing some failures which lead back to step number 2 about the adaptability. He believes this would have created a more believable and satisfying portrayal of a highly intelligent character, one whose actions are seen through outcomes rather than seeming omniscience. His quote. But again, he's misdiagnosing a problem with the final scene and then applying it to the rest of the show. First of all, we do see plans and preparations as the boys try to follow her. She's seen talking to Todd and friends and then then later, with Homelander, we see her standing there while the plan is executed. What's the plan? Kill home teamers and make it look like the other guys. Then we get into the leak stuff. So the goal is to frame 2 innocent men, and A-Train is able to find and steal the footage that exonerates those men and hands it to the boys. For now, we know that Sage is part of the framing plan, and after the footage is gone, she's like, we gotta find the leak because it didn't just run out of crime analytics, which leads Homelander to set his sights on the Deep, not as the leak, but as responsible. Then later, A-Train and Sage stand together, and Sage is being super obvious, like, gee, I wonder who the leak is. And at this point, it's obvious she knows it's him. And if you're like me and had the extra theory about Sage having a different agenda from Homelander, then this part also fits into her later telling Homelander she used A-Train as the leak. She claims it's because he was the perfect misinformation system, but he could also have been her way of exonerating those 2 innocent men so they wouldn't end up as collateral for Homelander and her plan. Regardless of what her true intentions are, we constantly get a ton of scenes with her in the plans, including her hiring the shifter later on. She's also demonstrated her adaptability when plans go awry, because Homelander sent Deep and Noir after Starlight and Butcher, which wasn't supposed to be part of the plan. And this, of course, leads to them finding out about A-Train being the leak, which also wasn't supposed to be part of her plan. How does she adapt? She explains to Homelander, this was my plan, this was my reasoning, I had to keep it from you, which also ties into number 3, her revealing steps of the plan, which honestly is the same as number 1. She leaves like Homelander tells her to, and then we don't see her again. At this point, there's nothing left for her to do anyway, except maybe set up some contingencies like the one with Singer, and the reason we don't see that is because the writers wanted to surprise the audience. You see how overly manufactured this plot is already, and you're saying you wanted more? And if you think we're done, I've also included comments conversation in the article linked below. So quick recap for our spoiler-free friends. Basically what the guy did with Sherlock was use 2 scenes from the pilot to represent the entire show, and then misrepresent those scenes, and then just made stuff up to back up his arguments. Then with The Boys, Sage's issue was not a character writing issue, but a scene writing issue and a general across the board season issue. Now we'll discuss 3 shows all at once with no spoilers, and if you think we're done with the false equivalencies, not quite. This guy goes on to talk about good examples, citing Tyrion from Game of Thrones, and explains how Sherlock and Sage would behave if confronted with the same problem. He introduces Tyrion's problem, which is to find out about a potential leak between 3 people. He then says if this was Sherlock, Tyrion would just walk into a room and identify the culprit instantly based on their sweat volume, heart palpitations, pupil dilation, or even based on their clothes or perfume. This isn't Sherlock though. One's set in the modern world in 2010, and the other is fantasy inspired by medieval decor. Tyrion is not a trained detective. He doesn't have centuries of modern science predating his existence, and more importantly, this isn't even accurate to Sherlock's character, and we know this because the show actually does have multiple storylines with a similar problem. The first is Scandal in Belgravia, which involved a leak, and show fans will know how that panned out, and the second is Empty Hearts, where he has to figure out which of the politicians is involved with the terror cell, and he does this by tracking a ton of different markers, not just by looking at people. Then with The Boys, he says Tyrion wouldn't even be seen on screen for the show. Someone else, like Ned Stark, would figure out the leak, and then Tyrion would show up saying this was all my plan. Did you watch the show? We literally just talked about season 4 of The Boys involving a leak, and we talked about how that was handled and how it relates to the plan. Of course, Video Guy's not even comparing the 2 leak situations. He's comparing Tyrion's leak situation to a different situation involving Sage talking to Homelander. It's not comparable, and we've already discussed the Sage stuff with spoilers previously, so moving on. And by the way, what he said isn't even true. He said Tyrion's in a position where he has to go find out who's leaking information about him. No, that is not accurate. He's cleaning house and stacking his cabinet with people he can trust not to go whispering to his sister. Now, if you haven't seen Game of Thrones, skip ahead because we're gonna get into some spoilers here. Timestamps below. In fact, right before this, he kicks out the previous Lord Commander because he knows that guy only listens to the king. Nobody's leaked anything yet. Tyrion's not thinking, oh, somebody's spilling my secrets to Cersei. I better find out who that is. He's worried preemptively that Cersei is looking for any possible weakness against him, and so he needs to figure out who might do that, not who's currently spilling his secrets, because nobody's doing that. So then Video Guy explains how Tyrion executes the plan, feeding 3 people 3 different pieces of info and kicking out the one who snitched. But you're not even gonna acknowledge the actual intelligence of this plan? He's not telling people some random stuff. He specifically came up with something that he knew his sister would be triggered by, the betrothal and the subsequent shipping away of her daughter. The plan's fine, but it's the content of what he told those people that really worked. And the true intelligence is defined not from the plan, but from his ability to understand that this is what really makes the plan. Because if he just told them, oh, I'm sending a spy to these 3 locations, or oh, I'm trying to get my hands on these 3 important artifacts, how would he know who went off and told Cersei? She's not gonna come screaming at him saying, you asshole, I can't believe you're looking for this mysterious battle axe. But if she finds out Tyrion's secretly planning to ship her daughter off to marry a stranger for alliance purposes, you bet your ass she's on her way to scream her head off. And by the way, I actually did a rewatch reaction analysis video of the writing of this particular episode of Game of Thrones last year, so that's linked below if you want to check that out. Anyway, this guy saying Tyrion follows the definition of intelligence he established earlier in his video rather than being magical is yet another false equivalency. Like, I swear to God, this guy needs to stop. Sherlock is a show based on books that are founded on the premise of an extreme level of observation and deductive reasoning. Anyone reading those books was literally signing up for that premise. They want to see that type of character. Same goes for Sage. Her character is built on the premise that a superpower allows her brain to always regenerate. And in both these cases, we've established they aren't written like magic anyway. And specifically with the boys, that show has 99 writing problems, but Sage's intelligence is not one of them. To close out this section, this video guy basically says that Tyrion's plan followed the cause and effect rule that this video guy established because he identified possible suspects, came up with an entrapment plan, executed the plan, and then identified and confronted the culprit. He says each action flows into the next and the result is satisfying because it feels genuinely smart. But he doesn't actually go into the scene like I just did a few minutes ago in the spoiler breakdown, and in fact, he did this with both other shows. He just states these things and you're supposed to believe that this is true. Listing that Tyrion demonstrated value, established dominance, nurtured dependence, and so on doesn't actually mean anything. You have to actually tell us how his actions fit into the things you listed, because you can map this plan onto anyone. To refer to the Dennis system I just mentioned from Always Sunny, Dennis always identifies his target, comes up with an entrapment plan, executes the plan, and then separates entirely. Does that make him intelligent? Considering how he tries to do it again after ditching the girl he Dennised, I'd say this particular instance does not. And according to this video guy's definition of intelligence, this one part about executing the plan speaks for Dennis's character as a whole. Video guy then goes on to say Tyrion's actions demonstrate logical problem solving, strategic planning, and utilization of the available resources and information. Okay, sure, but Tyrion does not work as a contrast to Sherlock and Sage because, say it with me, false equivalency. His second example of well-written intelligence was No Country for Old Men, which I can't comment on because I've never seen it, so let's get into this guy's conclusion. He says the difference between a well-written smart character and a poorly written one is based on the visibility of their thought process. He says badly written ones rely on superhuman deductive abilities, but how do you make this generalization simply based on your misinterpretation of Sherlock? What other characters use deduction at a high level? This guy also said impossible foresight, retroactive genius, and lack of cause and effect are other ways to badly write an intelligent character, and obviously these are all directly related to his criticisms of Sage, which were also incorrect. So how can you prescribe, oh, badly written intelligence has these very specific qualities? He says by contrast, well-written intelligent characters show logical problem solving, adaptability, use of available resources, and a clear visible thought process. So if a character isn't showcasing these things, then does that mean that their intelligence is not well written? Let's look at Elizabeth Bennet from Pride and Prejudice. Elizabeth does not showcase any problem solving in this entire story. It simply doesn't come up. She doesn't show any adaptability because again, it doesn't come up. Does she use any available resources? I mean, this doesn't really pertain to her issues. And does she have a clear visible thought process if we're talking about the movie and not the book? Because obviously a book can show internal thoughts. But I guess this one's a yes because she does tell Mr. Collins and Mr. Darcy why she rejects them, and later we can see why she changes her mind about Darcy. So she only checks one box, but that doesn't have anything to do with her intelligence, unless the intelligence in question is her being able to overcome her pride. Does that mean her intelligence is not well written? And before you say false equivalency, let's think about the premise of this video. It's not I hate the genius character trope, it's this is how not to write intelligent characters, and this is how to write intelligent characters. And to support this premise, there are two examples of each, followed by prescriptive guidelines of exactly what all this should and shouldn't look like. But if you're writing a story like Pride and Prejudice and your main character's intelligence doesn't really have anything to do with creating plans or making deductions, then how can you use this advice? And how can you actually discern whether a character's intelligence is well written? It's actually not quite so prescriptive. People don't realize that so much of a character's traits, if well written, come across in the little things, the smaller moments, brief dialogue scenes. It comes up in the way they're faced with and handle certain situations. It's not based on one specific scene that a critic might misinterpret. It's accumulation of their experiences, pieces of a puzzle that come together to form this character. There's just so much to take into account, so many different variations and interpretations of intelligence. Rather than framing this video as an analysis of how to write intelligent characters, it should have been framed as why I don't like this trope. This video instead should have been about the suspension of disbelief when it comes to this trope, because ultimately that's his real issue, right? He has a tough time believing that Sherlock and Sage could pull off what they've pulled off, but he fully believes that Tyrion and the other example guy were able to pull off what they pulled off, and that's because the first two fall into the genius character trope and the latter two do not. If he wanted to say this is about intelligent characters, he would not have pitted two genius trope characters against two regular characters who happen to operate intelligently. I mean, would you put Jack Sparrow in this video? He's commonly cited as very smart, but then again, so is the entire principal cast of pirates. Elizabeth, Will, Barbossa, they're all smart. None of these are part of the genius character trope. And furthermore, both his criticisms of the members of the genius character trope stem from his own misunderstandings. So this writing advice was doomed from the start. The rest of the video is just him repeating the same stuff he's been saying, telling us that this is important information for both readers and writers when it comes to consuming media and understanding the craft of intelligent characters. So again, his premise doesn't line up with what he actually has a problem with. And by the way, the suspension of disbelief for this trope is his own personal problem, not a writing problem for either show, as we've established, because that has to do with the establishment of the story world. For example, if you sign up to watch White Chicks and you can't suspend your religious belief that these two dudes are dressed up like very strange looking girls, then this movie is not for you, because that's literally what makes the movie so funny. But finally, the nightmare is over. Isn't it crazy how someone can spend 15 minutes making shit up and everyone believes them, but you have to go through all this to disprove the lies? The BS asymmetry principle. So the moral of the story is, we should be mindful of the media we consume, as well as the analyses and criticisms of that media, plus bad faith criticisms of criticisms, because that also happens a lot, especially from fans of something or someone being criticized, or even criticisms of criticisms of criticisms from people who hate the thing being criticized, and the loop goes on forever. Remember, we don't always need to form our opinions or ideas straight away. It's okay to take time to think about something. It's okay to not agree with everyone, and we're probably not seeing a true consensus anyway because it's impossible to accurately reflect such a thing. But we also don't have to disagree just to be mindful. Critical thinking and analysis is an ongoing process, and it's something we're going to be building for the rest of our lives. But not all criticism or praise is as easy to disprove as this one. It can definitely be hard to keep your head straight when faced with so much external influence. So much of the way we think about movies and shows and criticism in general is based heavily on shared culture, and this is a phenomenon I'll be talking about real soon. So in the meantime, I'm Harry, and this was Trash Talk Reverse.